You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're taking a look at the controversy over Iran's nuclear program. Western diplomats have described this weekend's talks with Iranian officials in Istanbul as positive. While they have agreed to hold further talks, it remains clear that a gulf exists between Iran and some of its interlocutors. And Iran's chief negotiator, Saeed Jalili, made it clear that he will not accept the key demand to halt enrichment of uranium to 20%. Such a purity of fissile material is beyond the quality Iran needs to generate electricity, which is its purported reason for the nuclear project. And it stokes Western and Israeli fears that Iran is really covertly heading towards building doomsday weapons. So, is this step-by-step approach of confidence-building measures going to pay off? Are the sanctions hurting Iran's economy enough to coerce Tehran into changing course? And is the much-discussed attack on Iranian nuclear facilities by Israel or the United States still on the cards? To probe these questions, we're hosting a debate in our London studios. I'm joined by Patrick Hayes, the political commentator for the website Spiked, Matthew Harris, the Liberal Democrat pro-Israel blogger, David Cliff, researcher for a monitoring arms control agreements group called Vertic, David Morrison, a blogger on Western intervention in the Middle East, and over the line from Russia by Andrei Baklitsky from the Russian Center for Policy Studies. Okay, to get the ball rolling, I'd like to get a single sentence answer from each of you to the following question. Maybe to you first, Patrick. Is a war with Iran more or less likely following the weekend meetings?
I think following the weekend meetings, basically a potential war with Iran has been put on hold for a period of time. It's been kicked into the long grass by these because no one wants to deal with the situation at the moment.
Okay, Matthew.
I've never anticipated a war with Iran, and I would have thought that this makes such an outcome less likely rather than more.
David.
I don't think it's changed the possibility of war. I'd agree with Patrick that I think that war is now less imminent than it would have been had Istanbul been an obvious abject failure.
Okay, and David?
Depends on whether the United States and its allies are prepared to allow Iran to have uranium enrichment on its own soil, which is its right under the NPT. The matter could have been settled back in 2005 if the West had been prepared to allow Iran to have uranium enrichment on its own soil.
Okay, and finally over to you, Andrei.
The possibility of war is definitely going down. It's less possible at the moment, at least for the point that there was jokes during the IAEA inspectors visiting Tehran this winter that at least while they are there, no one would bomb Tehran. So that's the point. No one would bomb Tehran till May 23rd.
Okay, well, I suppose everyone has agreed on this point, and I suppose that's good news if you want to avoid war. I think at this moment I'm going to start playing you a few audio clips. The first one is from Iran's chief negotiator, Saeed Jalili.
We agreed to continue the talks on a range of issues which are of mutual interest. This in order to enter a constructive and positive process for comprehensive and sustainable cooperation. We emphasize that this process of cooperation must be based on a step-by-step and reciprocal approach, especially regarding nuclear issue. What's important is that we agreed that any cooperation has to be based on the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty.
David, perhaps over to you, because this is the point that you were talking about. Jalili there saying that all agreements must be based on the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which, from I think what you were saying, Iran isn't breaching.
No, it isn't breaching. Uranium enrichment is allowed under the Non-Proliferation Treaty as long as it's for peaceful purposes. And back in 2005, whenever the three EU states, the United Kingdom, France and Germany, were negotiating with Iran about this matter, had those EU states and the United States, who no doubt was pulling their strings, been prepared to agree at that point in time that Iran would have uranium enrichment on its own soil, there isn't any real doubt that arrangements could have been come to ensure that, to give confidence to people outside Iran that its enrichment was not going to be used for weapons purposes.
I'll throw that one over to David, because this is very much in your area of expertise. Your group is a monitor on arms control agreements. Is there no reason for any concern in the way that Iran's behaving?
No, absolutely not. Iran isn't breaching the NPT by enriching uranium. It has a right to do that under the NPT, but that right is conditional on Iran's commitment not to be proliferating nuclear weapons. And the IAEA have said on several occasions, and most recently in November 2011, that they have serious concerns over what kind of weaponization activities are going on or potentially going on in Iran. Up until 2003, the understanding is that these activities were part of a structured program. There is concern that some activities relevant to weaponization may still be ongoing. And I think what we have to remember is that Iran continues to be enriching uranium to 20%. And what has changed since Friday, since the talks in Istanbul on the ground, nothing has changed. The enrichment to 20% is currently continuing, and 20% puts you close to having weapons-grade uranium. There should continue to be concerns over the lack of transparency that Iran is showing over its nuclear program, its continuing enrichment activities, and the suspected weaponization that may or may not be going on there.
That's the point that I'm going to play you a second audio clip, and it's following on very much from what David was saying there, and it's the response from the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu.
Iran has been given a freebie. It's got 5 weeks to continue enrichment without any limitation, any inhibition. I think Iran should take immediate steps. First, stop all enrichment, take out all the enriched material, and dismantle the nuclear facility in Qom.
Okay, Matthew, Iran been given a freebie.
I get where Mr. Netanyahu is coming from on that, because after so much stalling and secrecy on Iran's part, one swallow really doesn't make a summer in terms of saying, yes, we'll talk and we'll come back in Baghdad on 23rd of May. So expressing himself in his usual pungent fashion, the Israeli Prime Minister has a point to say that this is a relatively small gesture on Iran's part. Nevertheless, it is to be hoped that the talks on 23rd May will become substantive, and that together with sanctions, they will provide a way to steer the Iranians away from a nuclear weapon program.
And Patrick, what was your take on Netanyahu's comments?
Well, I mean, I think the thing that's important to remember is actually there are good reasons as to why Iran would want to develop nuclear power plants within the country. It wants to develop to ensure its people have a Western standard of living. And that's one of the positive things that came out of the Istanbul talks. You had the EU's foreign policy chief, Baroness Ashton, saying that she thinks that Iran should have a right to a civil nuclear power program. Lots of other countries also have the kind of nuclear capability that Iran does, for example, Brazil or Argentina, but they're not subject to that level of scrutiny. Now, I think the key thing here actually is, it's a question of trust. Iran is being very heavily scrutinised in an almost unprecedented way, and of course is reacting accordingly. I don't think there's anything that it can do that will placate Israeli fears that it's going to be developing a nuclear bomb, save actually stopping all development and refinement of uranium in the country. And I think that's going to cause very real problems for the development of the country.
That's the question from Patrick, that there's an imbalance in the scrutiny that Iran is under. David, is that fair?
Well, I think Iran has been under a lot of scrutiny over recent years, but I think the reasons for that are good. And I disagree that there is nothing more that they could do. One thing that Iran could do is to sign up to the IAEA's additional protocol.
Also, if you're going to compare Iran to Brazil or Argentina, Brazil and Argentina are not brutal theocracies. Brazil and Argentina do not sponsor terrorist groups all over the world. And Brazil and Argentina do not threaten to wipe other countries off the map. So I think it's reasonable in the circumstances that Iran is subjected to a greater degree of scrutiny than is either Brazil or Argentina.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're discussing the controversy over Iran's nuclear program. I'm joined by Patrick Hayes, a political commentator for the website Spiked, Matthew Harris, the pro-Israel Liberal Democrat blogger, David Cliff, researcher for an arms control monitor called Vertic, David Morrison, a blogger on Western intervention in the Middle East, and over the line from Russia by Andrei Baklitsky from the Russian Center for Policy Studies. Maybe I'll pass that one over to you, David, on the line. We got claims there that Iran is a sponsor of terrorist groups, that it has threatened to wipe other countries off the map, and therefore should fall under a greater degree of scrutiny than these other countries that are developing nuclear electricity generating technology.
It should be subject to the NPT, which it is signed up to. And David Cliff mentioned a moment ago that it should sign up to the additional protocol. And hopefully, as a result of the negotiations which have begun at the weekend, this may very well be part of the end result. The situation was that back in 2005, it certainly was implementing the additional protocol. And lo and behold, the UK, France and Germany made proposals to it which insisted that it give up uranium enrichment on its own soil. That's why it withdrew from the additional protocol. Now, if the West has changed its policy on this, and there's no definite evidence that it has, but if it has changed its policy and is now prepared to allow Iran to enrich uranium on its own soil for peaceful purposes, then I'm fairly certain that Iran will indeed sign up to the additional protocol again and implement it. One thing that needs to be said over and over again about the IAEA report of last November, and its more recent one in February, I think it was, is that the IAEA has found no diversion of nuclear material at Iran's nuclear facilities. It has said that over and over again since about 2003.
But surely the IAEA has concerns about a potential Iranian nuclear weapon and has expressed them in its reports.
Information which is supplied by third parties. And the previous Director General of the IAEA, Mohammed El-Baradei, who was in possession of most of this information, decided that because it was not verifiable by the IAEA, that he wouldn't publish it. What changed was the Director General of the IAEA changed. And lo and behold, the information which had previously been considered not worthy of publication because of doubts about its veracity, the new Director General, whom, as everybody knows, is the United States' man, lo and behold, this information appeared in a 16-page annex.
Maybe I'll throw that one over to you, Andrea. I'd like to get the view from Moscow, because obviously Russia has been party to voting through the UN Security Council to impose sanctions against Iran. But what's the Russian perspective? Is the threat of Iran developing nuclear weapons real?
Well, first of all, I would like to state that Russia is in no position to be welcoming Iran to get nuclear bombs, because we have a border with Iran that doesn't have nor United States, neither UK. So that's a big problem for Russia. So if you look from the technical point of view, Iran is not really violating NPT, but there are some serious questions with how it is working with its safeguards agreement. Because, for example, according to the Code 3.1 to the IAEA safeguards, Iran should tell IAEA when it's planning to build an enrichment facility, and actually didn't, both with Natanz and with Fordow. And both of those were found, and later Iran acknowledged it, they were found by third parties giving information to IAEA, and that's a problem, I guess, when you're trying to clandestinely build a nuclear enrichment facility. Then again, Iran has another problems which were already stated by other commentators, but for example, when you say that some things were not verifiable and that's why they were not put in any report, IAEA actually asked for the permission to verify them, for example, with Parchin complex, where they believed that Iran held some tests, of some explosion tests, and Iran just didn't let them in. So that's a good question if you just dismiss the facts which you cannot verify, or the party don't let you to verify them. And again, talking about peaceful nuclear energy, when we are talking about peaceful nuclear energy per se, we are talking about 3.5 enrichment, because for a nuclear power plant you need only 3.5, and there is only one nuclear power plant at the moment in Iran. It's the one which Russia built, and Russia is supplying the fuel for it and taking the fuel back. So at the moment, Iran doesn't need anything for its nuclear power program to continue. And the 20% one, which is actually not 20%, it's something like 1975, because they're not wanting to get to the 20%, because starting from 20% is where you get the high enriched uranium. So the 19% which they're having at the moment, they are planning to use in Tehran research reactor, which is quite legitimate, but at the moment they have already produced this highly enriched uranium for some 9 years of research reactor operating, and they're still going on. So there's a question arising, is there just storing it for some future purposes, or there is a problem with that? And it's mainly, there should be clarification of that. So that was Russian position from the beginning, that there is a problem, and we should clarify it. We should not bomb Iran, we should not invade Iran, but we should clarify the question, and that's actually what is going on at the moment.
You're saying that the jury is still out?
Yeah, of course, because the talks of this weekend was just, we will continue talks. So, yeah, the questions are still there, and we hope that IAEA would turn in and Iran would let them in, and the questions would be clarified.
Matthew or David Cliff, is the jury still out as far as you're concerned?
I think the jury's still out. As for whether Iran should be allowed to keep enrichment, I think that points to a broader question about the dangers of enrichment as a dual-use technology. And I think we're in the context of Iran, we have to ask the question of what kind of level of what's called a latent weaponization capability is the P5+1 willing to let Iran have? And any kind of enrichment facilities at all would give it a measure of nuclear weapons latency, in as much as those facilities could be, at some future point, geared towards the production of weapons-grade, highly enriched uranium. I think Russia actually is one of the countries that is taking the position that Iran should be allowed to keep an enrichment capability, but only if the international community has full confidence in the peaceful intentions of its program. I understand that a proposal will be tabled at the Baghdad meeting that will see some kind of reduction in enrichment, either the level or the extent of enrichment, in return for a gradual reciprocal rolling back of sanctions. But I think, yes, the jury is still out. And there is a lot that Iran could be doing. As I said, I mentioned the additional protocol, but Iran could also begin re-implementing this Code 3.1 that would provide early design information on its facilities. And you have to remember that Iran has said that it wants to build 10 new enrichment facilities. So early design information for them would be absolutely essential.
Well, you talk about, is the jury still out on this? My main concern here is who the jury thinks it is, because, I do think it's important to emphasise the importance of national sovereignty and self-determination of nations. And what we're seeing here is the IAEA and, other countries which have already stashes of nuclear weapons, effectively telling Iran what it can or cannot do within its own borders, and using the IAEA, which I don't think is politically neutral, as some people are kind of making out here. Remember, the US is a depository nation for the IAEA statutes. It got the report before anyone else. It tends to direct and steer the IAEA in particular directions. What you've got is the US effectively steering a lot of this kind of rhetoric against Iran when it's the only country that has ever dropped an atomic bomb on a civilian country. I mean, I think it's important to go back to first principles a bit on this. Why should Iran repeatedly say it needs to be increasingly transparent? Why should Iran always give what I would call colonialists in weapons inspectors' clothing license to come in and poke its nose all around the country?
I think the suggestion that the international community to say that the United Nations to accuse them of being colonialists, I would call that wide of the mark. And I think that the call to go back to first principles, my problem with that is that in the real world we have to accept that some countries behave differently from other countries. Therefore, a country like the United Kingdom, it is perhaps reasonable to assume, can be trusted to have nuclear weapons without much likelihood they're going to become a rogue state and drop them on people. When you look at the politics of Iran, I'm sorry, it's not easy to reach the conclusion that leaving Iran with nuclear weapons is a safe option for the world.
That is the colonialist kind of arguments, really. We can't trust the Iranian people to be able to determine their own futures. Therefore, we need to kind of poke our nose in and make sure they're doing the right thing, monitor it all the way. Talk about living in the real world. America is the only country to have ever dropped a nuclear bomb. That didn't not happen. It actually, it happened in 1945 on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
You don't hear President Barack Obama talking about wiping other countries off the map, do you?
You can have all the rhetoric you like. As it goes, you do have William Hague and Benjamin Netanyahu and others using quite strong language, I agree, not as severe, about Iran as well. So you can understand why Iran, which is increasingly marginalised, with very few allies in the region or internationally, will be put under pressure to start talking about enriching uranium up to 20%. It needs to try and defend itself. It needs to at least give the impression to its civilian population. I think it's important to always draw a distinction between what Iran needs to do to placate its civilian population and what it and also the kind of posturing and discussions on an international stage.
But what Iran's civilian population wants is the sort of free elections that was recently denied, when they had elections that only different types of conservative were allowed to stand and liberal reformers and others were not. I mean, it's not that many years since we had the Green Revolution in Iran, which was brutally repressed. There's a lot of evidence in what polling there has been that Iran's population, what they want is democracy, economic reform, greater freedom of expression. They want those things long before they want nuclear power, let alone nuclear weapons.
As far as I am aware, the opposition in Iran has always supported the notion that Iran should have a civil nuclear program.
Which opposition?
The Green opposition. There's no disagreement about this, as far as I know, in Iran, that they should continue to develop a civil nuclear program.
A civil nuclear program maybe, but not one that involves the potential for nuclear weapons.
Oh, yes. I mean, I agree. I mean, there's certain basic facts that need to be brought to bear on this issue to begin with. One is that we're all agreed, I am sure, that they have no nuclear weapons currently. U.S. intelligence has repeated over and over again since 2007 that it hasn't got a nuclear weapons program. And indeed, the Director of National Intelligence of the U.S., giving evidence to a Senate committee on the 16th of February, as far as I remember, said the United States and Israel are on the same page about this issue. In other words, Israel knows as well that Iran hasn't actually got a nuclear weapons program. I mean, Iran is surrounded by nuclear weapons states. It would be entirely reasonable, in my view, for it to seek nuclear weapons, but it's committed under the NPT not to do so. One of the great double standards about the Middle East is that the West pretends that it's in favour of a nuclear-free zone in the Middle East, but there's only one state in the Middle East with nuclear weapons at the moment. They are the ones who introduced nuclear weapons into the Middle East, and there will be no nuclear weapons-free zone until they get rid of them. And you have this ridiculous situation today in which Iran, a state that has got no nuclear weapons, is under fearsome economic sanctions, while a state in the Middle East that has nuclear weapons, very many of them, perhaps hundreds of warheads, is the recipient of £3 billion a year of military aid from the United States. The double standard is incredible. And there's a double standard in another way as well. Back in 1981, the Security Council passed Resolution 487, demanding that Israel open its nuclear facilities to IAEA inspection. And where is the sanctions in Israel to bring that about?
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're discussing Iran's controversial nuclear program. I'm joined by Patrick Hayes, a political commentator for the website Spiked, Matthew Harris, the Liberal Democrat pro-Israel blogger, David Cliff, a researcher for an arms control monitor called Vertic, David Morrison, a blogger on Western intervention in the Middle East, and Andrei Baklitsky from the Russian Center for Policy Studies. Andrei, I'd like to turn back to you for a second now, because we've been talking about the number of allies that Iran has in the region and the fact that it's surrounded by possibly enemies and nuclear armed ones. I'd just be interested in getting your take on what the conflict in Syria, what impact that is going to have on Iran and its nuclear program and its diplomatic relations with the rest of the world, because we're more than 1 year into the civil strife and conflict in Syria, which is possibly going to end in a change of government in that country.
Well, one of the things which is closely connected to the recent talks was the thing that at first the Iranians were against Istanbul because Turkey was having a really hard stand on Syria. And, well, if you look on the map of the Middle East, Turkey is the only country which can invade Syria to overthrow Bashar Assad. And they were doing things in the direction that they should intervene because there were some fightings on the borders between Turkey and Syria, and Turkey was talking about they could implement the Article 5 of Washington Agreement because Turkey is a NATO member. So there was some tension on that. But as we see, it was pretty peaceful, and Turkey seems did a good job to persuade all the countries to come together and talk. So I guess the Syria is not really influencing a lot in the moment, because Iran doesn't have a lot of allies in the Middle East at the moment. But it really seems that Syria is more of a liability than an asset for Iran, because it cannot help really, but it could provoke some new conflicts in the region, which Iran does not really want. Because imagine, for example, Turkey overthrowing a regime in Syria, and you have another Sunni radical state just next to Iranian borders. And I don't think that Iran is really interested in that. So I wouldn't say that there is a direct connection between those things. Of course, they are linked, but I would not say that if you're discussing the Iranian nuclear program, things that are happening in Syria are really important.
David Morrison, do you have anything to add to that?
Clearly, it would be a bit of a blow to Iran if it lost its ally in the Assad regime in Syria. Happily, in Syria, Kofi Annan has adopted the Russian position and insisted that there A, be a ceasefire, and B, that there be an attempt, going to be very difficult, but at least an attempt to bring about a reform within Syria that might conceivably allow that state to function again. It's a bit of a long shot, but I suppose it might end up falling apart like Iraq did, and perhaps causing all sorts of trouble in the region. You could have Lebanon falling apart as well. But it's clearly, I'm sure Iran would much prefer that the Assad regime maintained itself in Syria. That's fairly unlikely. We can't just hope that some sort of political solution is arrived at that prevents thousands or hundreds of thousands of people being killed.
Okay, we're running out of time, but I'd like to get Matthew back in quickly.
I just have to hope that the deal that Kofi Annan has brokered with the observers is going to yield results. I think the Assad regime, both under the current president and under his father, has a record of massacring civilians in their thousands in a way that makes the current conflict look like almost a dress rehearsal for something far, far worse. And it really just has to be hoped that that sort of outcome can be avoided and that we can move to some sort of democratic, stable Syria that avoids a sectarian conflict.
And David?
And I agree with Andre. I don't think the issue in Syria is particularly linked to the nuclear issue in Iran. The Middle East is obviously in a state of flux at the moment, and the one thing I think we can definitely say for certain is that an airstrikes on Iran would just add a further level of destabilisation to the entire region. And just on the airstrikes, I think that in any case, regardless, I mean, I think it's been put on hold, as we mentioned at the beginning of the programme, but the threat is still out there, and I still think that nothing has changed from Istanbul to make an airstrike on Iran any more than a short-term fix to a problem that requires a durable long-term solution, and the problem is that an airstrike would make that kind of long-term solution less likely.
Okay, and Patrick?
I think the situation with Syria, Kofi Annan's intervention there, and it is an intervention into a sovereign country's affairs, is effectively putting a Syrian spring on ice. And his fetishisation of peace means that a lot of the battle of ideas and the struggle for the future of Syria is going to be kind of stifled. You may well have the rebel groups there now being cast as terrorists in a particular worrying way. So I'm nervous about the way in which Western intervention is starting to both intensify that conflict, is actually stopping it from being resolved, but I think also may internationalise it further. We've already discussed Turkey, and I think that's kind of something to watch. I don't think that's necessarily gone away yet, especially should the UN monitors who are going into Syria see that Assad is still bombing people. Whether or not he will maintain the peace treaty for much longer is an open question. But I think the same goes for Iran as well. The more there is kind of Western intervention, meddling and monitoring the situation in that country, the less likely you're going to have a situation where the Iranian people will actually take the democratic initiative themselves and actually potentially overthrow the regime there, which I think is something that I would certainly want to see.
Well, that was a very controversial point to end the discussion on there from Patrick Hayes, a political commentator for the website Spiked. I was also joined by Matthew Harris, the pro-Israel Liberal Democrat blogger, David Cliff, a researcher for the arms control monitor Vertic, David Morrison, a blogger on Western intervention in the Middle East, and over the line from Russia by Andrei Baklitsky from the Russian Center for Policy Studies. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl. Stay tuned for the latest world news headlines.